Welcome to Engineering with Rosie Live. Last time I did a live stream, I had some shocking technical problems at the start. So can you please reassure me that everything is working with the audio and the video, please, in the comments? Yeah, also let me know where you're watching from and what you're hoping to get out of the live stream today. So today we're going to be talking about offshore wind, some of the most exciting technology developments in that area. I'm not going to get too deep into the technical stuff because it's hard to do live, but I did get the point from some of your comments before the live stream that you're mostly pretty interested in, especially floating offshore wind and some of the kind of accompanying technologies. So I'm gonna take that on board for potential future like proper video topics where I can research and prepare animations and stuff. Okay, good. So comments are coming through that the audio is working okay this time, so that's good. Where have we got viewers from today? We've got David Montgomery from California. Who else have we got? QA library from the old world. What does that mean? Europe somewhere, I guess. Which is actually not a bad effort because it's not a good time for Europeans to be watching right now. Richard Warren, hello from Bangkok. Hi. I believe that's the first time that somebody has mentioned that they came from Bangkok, even though I'm sure there have been viewers from there before. Who else have we got? Taming the Jungle, an allotment diary from the UK. Lots of night owls calling in. Graham Brown from Melbourne. Where else have we got? Missouri, more UK, more Scotland. Geez, you guys stay up late. I go to bed early and wake up early. Oh, and someone from Australia, Manuel Celia from Bondi. Hi, in Bondi. Did you have intense rain yesterday? We had so much rain here, I think like over 100 mils. So yeah, wasn't the best day. Cool. So I need to start by thanking the sponsor of these live streams, WeatherGuard Lightning Tech. WeatherGuard makes strike tape, which is a retrofittable lightning protection system for things that go fast, like wind turbine blades and aeroplanes. These live streams wouldn't happen without their support, so big thanks to them. And then the whole Engineering with Rosie channel is supported by the amazing Patreon community, who I always ask for questions ahead of live streams and before I do interviews for my regular videos. So if you want to join us, then you can sign up at this link, which is not very well arranged with my name tag. There's links in the description as well. So the topics that I plan to cover today are mostly floating wind turbines and like really huge offshore wind turbines, some of the mainstream ones. And yeah, I'm not going to get too much into the technical details, but I'm going to be talking about a lot of the actual developments that are happening, like real things that are physically in the water in the world of wind, and talk about some of the the differences in constraints that offshore faces compared to onshore wind, and so how that can kind of, help us to predict what direction that these technologies are going to go in the future development. If we have time, we'll also do energy storage in combination with offshore wind and hydrogen wind turbines, but I suspect that we won't have time because I was just preparing this morning and there's a lot to get through in just the, regular offshore and floating offshore. So I'll just share then my screen. I asked on YouTube, a YouTube poll, is wind energy technology fully mature or will we see more progress in the coming years? And then the real question was, what big wind techs are you most interested in? And we've got floating offshore wind by a fair margin. Second was really big wind turbines, over 14 megawatts. So those are the two topics we'll be covering today. And then recyclable wind turbines was a close third at 22%. So I think that makes sense to separate that out better into its own live stream or video later on. There has been some really cool developments from major manufacturers and some smaller companies on that area. So I'll do that another time. So tell me in the comments, what do you think? Is wind energy mature or like fully mature, or is it still an exciting technology? because I'll admit that a few years ago, you know, I was working only in the wind industry, and I did feel like I wanted to move out of doing wind exclusively because it is such a mature technology. A lot of the emphasis now is on, you know, driving prices down, which is so important, and I'm really glad it's happening. But I like to work in those more of the early stage technology development just because I find that fun. So I wanted to branch out into other energy, renewable energy or energy transition technologies, a lot of energy storage. But, you know, I think I've started to feel like maybe I was a bit too in the wind scene when I thought that, and now that I've stepped out, I can see that there is heaps of exciting stuff happening with really brand new technologies in wind. So I think I was probably a bit I don't know, dismissive back then, and now I'm excited again. But what about you guys? Got some comments. So Peter Ross says it's still got a way to go, and that there will be a step change in efficiency somewhere. That's interesting. I'm not sure that I think that there's going to be any big changes in efficiency. I think the changes that I see that are the most exciting are more about, you know, being able to put it more locations and make it cheaper. But let's see. And also, it obviously depends how you define efficiency. People mean all sorts of different things when they talk about that. QA Library says we'll be looking at 28 megawatt wind turbines in a year or so time. I don't know if in a year, but I think for sure, especially for offshore, we're going to keep on seeing them get bigger, and that's something I want to talk a lot about today. And then counterpoint, Richard Newton thinks turbines seem pretty well developed, not so sure about all the deployment options. So I'm not sure. Does that mean you think that there is more scope to make more deployment options, or if you think that that's a challenge? Oh, I just also wanted to mention that some of the other comments that people made on this YouTube post were wanting to know about energy storage, hydrogen, carbon sequestration in combination with offshore wind. And then there are actually several comments on airborne wind. So that's something I did do a live stream on a little while ago, so you can check that out on the channel. But I am also planning to take that and make like a proper video on airborne wind, because I know it's a really popular topic. Okay, so let's move on now to the main thing. I wanted to talk about why offshore wind. So just start out by sharing, this is the Lazard levelized cost of energy comparison. And I did also do a video just on this a little while ago. So you can check that out if you don't know what this is. But basically, it tells you how expensive are the different kinds of energy generation relative to each other. And here in this part, I don't know if you can see it, it's a bit small. We've got the section for wind. It's pretty cheap compared to all of the other options for generating electricity, either renewable or conventional. So this main bar here from $26 to $50 per megawatt hour is onshore wind. And then this point out here is $83, and that's their best estimate for offshore wind. So you can see it's kind of double, basically, the cost of onshore wind. So I know for me, for a long time, I was really stuck on this point and thought that offshore wind was a gimmick because, I mean, in the past, it was even a much bigger gap to onshore compared to offshore cost. And it's only recently that, you know, it's really started to blow up and get big and become a lot more mainstream, and you can kind of have to look beyond the cost and towards the value of offshore wind. So yes, it's more expensive. So why would you bother? I'm just going to bring up the Global Wind Atlas, which has the wind speeds around the globe. And yeah, so dark purple is like really high wind speed, and yeah, down to light blue is lower wind speeds. So you can see the really good, really good dark purple colors are all in these offshore areas. There's some around Australia too, especially around Tasmania. New Zealand's looking great. Yeah, and so in the offshore areas, you get much higher wind speeds than you do in all but like the very, very, very best onshore sites that you have to go mostly into like mountainous areas to get up really high to get stronger wind speeds or as strong wind speeds as you would see offshore. So that's one reason why. The next thing is that wind speeds are less variable offshore than they are onshore. So you have stronger winds more of the time. You can measure this with a capacity factor, which describes how much of the like the turbine rating you're getting on average. So, if you have a 1 megawatt turbine and you're getting on average half a megawatt, then you would have a capacity factor of 50%. Now for onshore wind, it varies, but you're, in the 30s and 40s probably for good onshore wind sites, and offshore 40 to 50 is pretty typical, and you do see some offshore wind sites pushing even beyond that. So that gives you the much better wind resource is one of the reasons why people are really starting to want to push offshore. But those two considerations are both accounted for in this cost of energy, levelized cost of energy. So that expensive price still isn't justified by those two factors alone. You have to also start thinking about that there's lower hour-to-hour variability, and also commonly in offshore wind locations, the best wind is at a time when, one, there isn't a lot of solar in the system, and two, when people want to use a lot of energy. And so that can mean you can get a really good price for the electricity that you're producing with an offshore wind farm compared to an onshore. And I just brought up this page on the Star of the South, which is probably going to be Australia's first offshore wind farm. They're still quite early in the development phase compared to where offshore wind projects are in the rest of the world. But one of the benefits they talk about the most is that the location that they've chosen in the Bass Strait, the offshore winds are strongly linked to the days and seasons with the highest demand for electricity, confirmed by 30 years of data from the Bureau of Meteorology. And it has its peak in the evening when everyone's using a lot of electricity when they get home and, start cooking dinner. And this is also a time when, we don't have solar anymore in the system. So you can get a good price for it. Those are the main benefits people talk about, but I think the other big one that I need to mention is just locations of where you can put it. I still think that at the moment, offshore wind is too expensive compared to onshore if you have the option of putting in a good onshore wind farm instead. So where you're seeing people talk a lot about offshore wind is one in Scotland. This map is really slow to refresh. I think my connection's really slow today. I hope that you guys are getting me through okay. But yeah, so Scotland is one area where there's a lot of offshore wind. It's a good, it's a really good resource. You can see it's very nice, dark purple, and all through this area, the North Sea and stuff in general. And then also in Japan. Where's Japan? So Japan's problem is mostly just they don't have a lot of renewable energy opportunities aside from offshore wind. They've got geothermal potential, but have been reluctant to develop it because they're not keen to mess up their national parks where the good geothermal resources are. So they're talking a lot about offshore. They have deep waters, so it's going to need to be floating offshore. And then if you look also, this map's really slow to load. If you look also at the US, one of the issues that they have with onshore wind over there is that their good onshore wind speeds, the good resources are, when it loads, the good resources are all in the middle of the country, but that's not where people live. People are living on the edges. And so you can see that whilst the onshore wind is not great over on the east coast, the offshore wind is pretty great. So that you can actually get the wind farms much closer to population centers by going offshore in the US. And you can imagine also it's a lot easier because if you wanted to build a wind farm, heaps of wind energy here, and I mean, they are building heaps of wind energy there. But if you want to connect that then to the population centers, then you need to put transmission lines in this across this, really long area, which means going through many different landowners' properties and getting, arranging it with them. So if you can just put a wind farm here instead, then you can, generally just connect it right in. And in Australia, we don't have any offshore wind yet, but we have plenty of people talking about it and developing projects or trying to develop projects. And they're pretty much all based around trying to connect into like a coal power plant or an old retired coal power plant that is near the coast, so they don't have to do much onshore new transmission because they can just kind of hook into it, on the ocean floor, and then a lot of them are planning underground cables to connect actually to that big transmission point, because obviously a coal power plant, they're huge, they already have a lot of transmission from them, and when they close down, then that's not going to be used, so it's kind of up for grabs. So that's the main benefits as I see them of offshore wind, and I still think that we're mostly going to see it where onshore wind doesn't make sense for one reason or another. And I think that is the main reason. A lot of people ask me, why haven't we got offshore wind in Australia yet? And I think one of the reasons is just the really great onshore wind resource. So Australians live all just crowded around the coast. And then there's a lot of spare land. It's not spare, it's beautiful land, and obviously people are doing something with it or just enjoying it. But there's a lot of land with pretty good wind speeds and also pretty good capacity factors. I know I was talking to one developer here in Canberra recently. They're developing a big wind farm in South Australia that they're planning to then connect to transmission to power the east coast. And they had capacity factors around 50% from that onshore wind farm, which is huge for onshore wind. And they said to me, why would we develop something offshore when we can get those great capacity factors onshore? So I think we will see offshore wind in Australia, but it's not as urgent for us because we still got no shortage of projects that are in the pipeline that people want to build onshore. Richard Warren's pointing out that it's 3 times the cost of solar, and can't recall if that is necessarily right. This chart, I don't know if it fully captures. It depends from place to place, obviously, how good your solar or wind resource is. So making comparisons is pretty hard to see what's going to make sense in a local area based on these global data. So in general, solar is the cheapest, but again, it's all to do with the value, what you're going to do with that electricity. So solar does all come on and off together, whereas wind has, it differs depending on where it is geographically. So you usually get a higher price for the electricity from wind than you do from solar. I can bring up some information to show that if you are interested, but just tell me if you'd like to see that. So Manuel says high voltage DC underwater transmission to help push turbine further out to sea. I think we are going to definitely see turbines getting pushed further out to sea. That wind resource gets better as you get further away from the shore, and I think we'll talk about it more when we talk about floating offshore wind, but that is one of the big things that I think is going to happen. Another one. So I try not to pick the same people over and over again, but sometimes I forget. What's the average time of installation as compared to solar? Much longer. It's much more complicated, especially for offshore. That's one of the big differences between offshore and onshore wind is the installation and maintenance is really, really hard. Philip Sheridan says locate pump storage out to sea, 150 meter high circular concrete tanks. And I definitely need to do a whole video on the topic of like offshore, offshore energy storage, because there are so many technologies out there. Nothing like actually being installed, but it's just such a great area of immense innovation at the moment. Any conceivable way that you can think of to store energy offshore, there's a startup that is developing it. So I definitely need to devote a topic to that, a video to that. And yeah, so pumped storage would be one of them. Or you can do kind of the opposite, and instead of pumping water, you can drag down something buoyant, and then like the same effect when you have if you ever done swimming lessons and used a kickboard, if you put that underwater, then it will fly up and hit you in the chin if you're not careful, and you can harness that energy to you can harness that as an energy storage possibility as well. Okay, so there's another question from Richard which ties on well to the next topic I wanted to go to anyway. He asked, what's the extra cost of offshore made up of labor, materials, infrastructure, etc.? And I mean, that is a pretty good summary. The tech differences to onshore come from different constraints. So one of them is that it's a lot more expensive installation and maintenance. So the installation is harder because obviously you've got to get everything out there with a boat. Also, the turbines tend to be humongous for reasons that we'll get into in a second. So it's not just like a little small common ship that can install these. You usually need some pretty specific pieces of kit, huge cranes and huge ships to carry them to get them installed. So that is one thing that drives some of the design decisions that people are making offshore, that they are trying to make the turbines simpler to install. And you see with floating offshore, for example, a lot of times they're assembling them close to the shore in the port, and then they'll actually tow the whole thing out already, kind of fully ready to go, and just moor it in its final location in an effort to reduce their installation costs. And then the maintenance is a really big one. I mean, obviously anyone who's ever lived really close to the ocean knows how destructive salt spray can be. And I mean, I've personally never worked on a project that was offshore, but I've worked on some that were quite close to the coast, and also nearly everything gets transported by sea. So, you might design something for an inland location, but it's been transported over the sea. So you can still get damage to things from that salty, corrosive environment. And yeah, I learned all sorts of lessons about how readily stainless steel can rust. You need to spec everything up several times to get it offshore. And then nothing lasts in the way that you think it's going to. So maintenance costs are much more expensive, not just because it's a challenging environment, so there's more maintenance needed. It's also because it is so hard to get there. So I had a colleague I used to work closely with, and he did a lot of offshore work. He had this one project that caused him a lot of headaches, that needed him to make a lot of visits. And he described to me the process that he would have to go through every time that he went to do maintenance or troubleshooting on this offshore system. And they would get every service technician that had to go out and do a project on a turbine in the offshore wind farm that day, they get them all together, and then they get in a boat, and some wind farms even use helicopters to get the service personnel out there. But he was in a boat, so they get the boat, and then they go around to each turbine one by one. They do a trip, like a bus with stops, drop people off, and then at the end of the day they come back and get you again. So he might only have had to do a half-hour job, but he would be out there for 12 or more hours, because obviously it depends how quickly the other people are finished. You can't leave until everybody's ready to leave, pretty much. And so you just end up with this immense cost to do any kind of maintenance. And that's why it's an especially difficult environment if you've got a new technology that hasn't been proven yet onshore. You don't want to be learning every tiny little thing that can go wrong with your system while it's offshore. It's much easier easier to do it onshore. And so you do see a lot of the prototype turbines for, they're intended for offshore markets. You see a lot of companies testing them onshore so that they can, save on those maintenance costs, because new techs need a lot of maintenance, a lot of learning, a lot of trial and error. And then another difference between onshore and offshore turbines is just the wind resource. The wind shear is less extreme offshore. And so I think I have a page for that. So we've got this one. I talked about it a lot in not the most recent video, but the one before that, where I was talking about why we don't see a lot of rooftop wind when we see so much rooftop solar. And one of the big reasons is that, close to ground level, the wind speed is is a lot slower than it is up high. So this chart, it shows a representation of wind shear. So up on the y-axis, we've got the height above ground, and then on the x-axis, we've got the wind speed in meters per second, and you can see the further that you get away from the ground, the higher the wind speed is. And actually, I think I did have a better chart for this in the live stream that I did on airborne wind, because that's the justification for that technology is the wind speed is so much high up. So yeah, things like trees and hills and houses, they all act to stir up the wind close to the ground. It slows it down, makes like a boundary layer. And so as you get away from that, the wind speeds are much higher, and so you get a lot more power out of the wind. But offshore, there's no trees. Offshore, there's not really buildings. There's waves sometimes, but in general, the ocean is very smooth compared to onshore. And so this wind shear profile is a lot less. And so there's not as much reason to put a really high tower on an offshore wind turbine as there is on an onshore one. So if you look at them side by side, then you're often going to see, you're going to notice that the offshore wind turbines look short compared to compared to an onshore one. They're not actually short because they're just huge in general, but proportionally speaking, that it's not like a really tall tower with a little rotor at the top. It's actually I have my turbine model here. So instead of having like all this extra tower length, the offshore ones, the ocean might be there. So that's one difference, and that's got some implications that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then finally, there's also big. So we talked about how the installation cost is higher for offshore, but there's also a lot of factors that make it really favorable to just have less turbines, bigger but less. So for example, if you had 5 2-megawatt turbines, then you need 5 separate connections, 5 separate subsea cables to connect those to to somewhere to take it to the shore. And if you had just one 10 megawatt turbine instead, then you only need one connection. And that the balance is quite different for offshore versus onshore. And that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the big reasons why offshore wind turbines are really just getting as big as they can, whereas onshore is a lot more, I feel like, plateaued. Oh, I got a comment from Dimitar. You still have a big monopile transition piece below the water level. Yeah, that's true. Depending on the water depth, you probably do have, like, all up, the structure is just as high proportionally, but the bit that you see sticking up doesn't need to be as doesn't need to get you away from the water surface as high. And obviously floating wind is trying to avoid this point. Okay, so now I just wanted to move on to some, like, where we're actually at with offshore wind. So the biggest wind turbines, and there was this cool animation. This is on visualcapitalist.com. These are all the big 14 megawatts or above wind turbines that exist today. They don't actually all exist. They exist in varying stages of physical existence. And I think every single one of these projects would tell you that they have the world's largest wind turbine. And it just depends what your definition of what is a wind turbine is. So we'll start on the far left. That's GE's Haliade X. that one does exist. They put a prototype of this in a couple of years ago in Rotterdam. It's got 108 meter long blades. It's 14 megawatts. So for sure at the time, that was the world's biggest offshore wind turbine. I haven't seen a lot of installation of, commercial units yet. But I could have missed some. So it's possible that there have been, and I know that they are definitely actively selling that one. They're claiming 60 to 64% capacity factor. I mean, it's a bit weird for the manufacturer to talk about that. It's got a lot more to do with the, where you put it rather than what the turbine's like. And you can always get whatever capacity factor you like by just changing the size of your generator. So yeah, you can see how big it is. 220 meter rotor, 260 meters height. Yeah, and then the next one is Siemens Gamesa's SG14. So they have got a prototype installed. I believe its installation is complete, but I don't think the commissioning is. So it should be commissioned later this year. Yeah. Oh, and I actually just had the video from their YouTube channel, Siemens Gamesa YouTube channel, on the installation. Yeah, looks like they're doing what I said, installing it onshore so that they can learn about that without worrying too much about all these maintenance issues that I mentioned. And the third one was a Vestas V236 15, 15 megawatts, so a little bit higher capacity. It has it's got a slightly larger rotor, and they're building the prototype now. I think that their prototype's supposed to be finished later this year. Then next across, we've got the MingYang 16 megawatt, so a bit bigger again, also claiming the world's largest, but their prototype's not going to be ready until next year. So it's a little bit, less advanced in its execution than the other ones. And I did see that Dongfang has also recently announced a 16 megawatt direct drive turbine with 128 meter long blades. So that, they're definitely getting long, not up to the 28 megawatts that one of the commenters earlier said. But, obviously they're still continuing to get bigger and bigger every single year. Okay, so, I'm not sure. I'm probably waffling on a bit. I was going to talk about some of the technical challenges for making the turbines this big, but I might move on to floating wind. But yeah, tell me if you're interested in that. I can also make a separate video about that, especially like the blades. So it's just really interesting how hard it gets to make a wind turbine blade that long. We're over 100 meters now, and for the previous 30 years of wind turbine development, it was all really incremental. They had a mostly fiberglass blade, and whether it was a 20 meter or 25 meter, 30 meter fiberglass blade, it was basically, the same design technique, the same design tools. You can still use all your test methods that you had before, and just like incrementally make it a little bit bigger each year. And it was pretty low risk. But I was working at LM Wind Power when we started making the blades for the Haliade X. They're 108 meters long, and it's not just an increment from the previous longest one that we were making was, I think, 88 meters. And there were so many brand new technologies that needed to be developed just for that. And the structural design of it is really interesting. That's my background. That's what my PhD is in. So tell me if you would like a whole video on that, because I'm not sure whether it's just me that geeks out over wind turbine blade structures. Okay, let's just take a look at some of the comments. Robert Pollock asks, how do floating platforms achieve stability? It's just kind of like how you would imagine doing it if you wanted to, make your model wind turbine float in your bathtub, and it's going to want to fall down. So you either make it just super buoyant and wide, or you add the tether points. You can make them tension so that it's kind of keeping it in place. There's a whole different range of ways to do it. I think that it's mostly all stuff that's come from the oil and gas industry, and certainly they've been making floating platforms for a long time. They have a bigger financial incentive to do it than for wind. And then obviously there's a big difference that you have this, like huge load, like cantilever load, or there's a big weight at a distance, so it's inherently a lot less stable than an oil and gas platform is much more close to the ground. That fact actually has caused people to look more to vertical axis wind turbines again, which haven't really been doing anything much onshore for the last 20-30 years. There's a few companies around, but you don't see a lot of them installed. But yeah, vertical axis wind turbine doesn't have the generator at the top. This is the big heavy thing here, all the way up here. If you can put it down the bottom, then obviously your floating challenge is hard, easier. But yeah, I don't believe there's anything particularly special about floating platforms for wind turbines compared to floating platforms for oil and gas. But I could do another live stream on this with an expert in platforms if people are really interested in the platform design specifically. Yeah, another question on that vein from Nigel. We will move on to floating. That's what we're going to talk about next. How can such tall turbines float reasonably vertically in a gale? And it mentions a blade tip height of 300 meters. I did see that there was one floating platform that their prototype had withstood 40 meters per second winds. So they are getting it done. And if you need to design it to withstand higher winds than that, then you just got to make it more buoyant, wider, more tethered. All of the above or any of the above. Okay, here's a question about capacity factor from Brandon. How often does a 15 megawatt turbine produce at max capacity versus half or less? So that's what the capacity tells you. The capacity factor tells you overall. So when companies are saying, this has got a 60% capacity factor, then it would mean that your 15 megawatt turbine would, on average, over the whole year, the whole project lifetime, would be producing 60% of that. So what's that, like 8 and a bit megawatts on average. So it's when it's low wind speed that's producing less than that. If there's no wind, it's producing less than that. And then the maximum it's ever going to produce is 15 megawatts, no matter how high the wind speed gets. And at a certain point it will cut out. But yeah, the capacity factor basically answers that question for you on aggregate. Lots of people requesting more technical details. So yeah, I just need to do the preparation to make sure I get the numbers right. I don't like to talk off the top of my head about anything with numbers in it. How about the increasing blade length and tower height? Do you think this will be a problem to install? And yeah, it is a challenge, and people are coming up with all sorts of different ways. At the moment, we're still seeing them mostly like, I showed it in that Siemens Gamesa video. I'll just put that back on. This is still how they're mainly being installed. The same offshore, just that crane goes on a boat, and every now and then you hear a story about someone who dropped a blade while they were installing it and just smashed the side of a ship, or lost their, the only blade that they had made for their prototype into the ocean. I think that they are like really pushing the limits of what is easy. Well, it's not easy now, but they're pushing the limits of what we can do with like really similar tech to what we are currently using. So definitely some of the technologies we're going to talk about in a second are attempts to get around those problems. Okay, just one last one because I know the answer to this quickly. Robert Pollock again. Do underwater structures are they beneficial for fish and mollusk populations? And I have seen quite a few studies recently that says yes. Basically any kind of, even an oil or gas platform as well, is probably also beneficial for certain fish and mollusks, because it's got, it's a new home for them. They like it. And I did also see some fishing studies for fishing boats that work in the areas of offshore wind in the US, and they also found that actually this is pretty good place to fish, is around these structures, because there's a lot of fish there. But then I saw one study about problems with the magnetic fields from the cables, subsea cables. There was a particular crab that got confused by the magnetic field, or they assume that that's what was confusing it, and they just kind of like stood still and didn't feed and didn't mate. So I think that there's pluses and minuses. It's definitely something that's being watched, especially in the US. I see nearly every week we see studies of, is this good for fish or bad for fish, and looking at whales as well, and the noise from the installation. And yeah, a presentation that I saw recently on the Star of the South, the Australian project, they showed they're not about to start construction or anything. They're still figuring out like what regulations do we even need for offshore wind in Australia. But they've already done years of environmental surveys in preparation for what they expect that they will need. So, they're watching birds, migrating birds, for example, and all sorts of marine life to see what's in the area and make sure that they're not, doing anything bad for those animals. Okay, so I'll just move on now to floating offshore wind. So we talked about the cost difference between onshore and offshore already, and saw basically around about a doubling from onshore compared to doubling. The offshore wind is double the cost basically of onshore roughly. And then there's not as much floating wind out there, like mature projects that are actually just operating, non-prototypes. So the economic data is pretty iffy, let's say, but people are estimating that it's about 3 times as much as a fixed, what do you call it? I don't know why I've forgotten the term, where it's not floating, the fixed foundation offshore wind turbines are about 1/3 the cost of a floating one. So why on earth would you bother? So that's going to take us out to, like way up here, like the most expensive basically of all the ways that you could generate electricity. So why would we bother? I think, again, it's quite similar to the reason why you would bother with offshore at all compared to onshore, like if you have to because you don't have other options. And Japan is a really good example of that. They've got deep waters there, so they have to. Scotland has deep waters, California has deep waters, so if they want to be able to get these, like you can see that these high wind speed areas are so much closer to where people live in California than if you have to get it from all the way over here. And the fish and the whales and the sea otters aren't going to put in, complaints against development proposals. So it's probably easier to get that transmission done there. So that's the main reason why I think that we move to floating, is because you have to. You can go much deeper, obviously, with a floating wind turbine compared to a fixed bottom. So I think that the maximum fixed bottom depth that an offshore wind farm is installed in yet is about 55 meters, whereas the world's deepest floating oil and gas platform is 2,450 meters. So, you can see that gives you a lot more range of where you can go. It is potentially an easier way to install. Even, we may eventually see, if the floating technology gets mature enough, we may eventually see people choosing to use floating even in shallower water, because you can, assemble it in the port and then drag it out there. And yeah, there can be some benefits with the way that it's actually moored, but there's also challenges. So the floating offshore, it's a lot newer than the fixed bottom offshore. Just go to some of the projects that exist. So this Hywind Scotland, this is the world's first floating offshore wind farm, and it has 5 6-megawatt Siemens turbines, so 30 megawatt wind farm, and it was commissioned in 2017, I'm pretty sure. In operation since 2017. So that was the first wind farm. There's been, the first offshore wind turbine was an 80 kilowatt project, a prototype off the coast of Italy in 2007. And since then, I didn't bring them all up because it'd take too long to go through them all. But I'd say there's been at least 10, maybe 20 different prototypes of floating wind turbines that have been tried. But and a lot of them are scale. Like this one is a scale. I think it's 1/8 scale, and there was a similar one in the US, a scale model, trying to figure out like what do we need to know before we make a big one. But this was the first wind farm, floating offshore wind farm. Same company also has one that they have just installed the first turbine at their second wind farm, which is in the Norwegian Sea. It is eventually going to have 11 8.6 megawatt turbines. And its purpose, you can see up here the little Equinor logo. Its purpose is to provide energy for offshore oil and gas processing. So, that's a whole separate can of worms. You can open your nose at a green project if it's going to power offshore oil and gas. But I personally think this is actually a really important partnership between these two industries. Partly because there's so much experience in the oil and gas industry for actually how to make platforms that work in the and are reliable in offshore environment. Secondly, they've got plenty of money which you need to develop this to mature floating offshore wind because as we saw currently the economics don't make sense on their own. So no one's going to be buying a floating offshore turbine just because it's a cheaper way to get energy. And then the other reason that I think it's not actually a bad idea to partner these industries together is that the oil and gas industry isn't going to go away even in a net zero global energy system. I think it's something like 15, maybe even 20% of oil and gas is used for non-combustion purposes. So, making products like plastic. And also currently, and then the industry that is there now needs to get smaller, a lot smaller, hopefully, like 85% smaller. But it's not going to happen overnight. And these existing projects, they use energy. At the moment they'll burn gas or diesel or some other fuel to get their energy needs. So that should be decarbonized like everything else. Also, these projects, a lot of the projects, they need more energy to pump out the last bit of the resource from their site. And I would rather see that happen than new ones open up because, if you move on to a new field, then you're going to want to be using that for decades to pay your investment back. So, I'm not a fan of the oil and gas industry, but I do think that this is going to be a partnership that we're going to see a lot of. And we should, get the benefit for the wind industry as well. I'm not try and be too ideologically pure about this one. I don't know, maybe that sounded like I was reading off a script or something. I actually struggled a bit with this aspect of it, whether I thought it was a good idea or not. So I did think it through. Okay, move on to the next wind farm, WindFloat Atlantic. This is a 25 megawatt wind farm in Portugal. Its first turbine was installed in 2019 and the third by 2020. It's 3 8 megawatt turbines. And then there is the Kincardine floating offshore wind farm, now fully operational, apparently since late last year. It's in Scotland. Water depths ranging from 60 to 80 metres and the largest operating wind farm. It has 5 Vestas 9.5 megawatt turbines and 1 2 megawatt turbine. So that gives it about 50 megawatts overall. And that's it. That's all of the floating offshore wind farms there are. You hear projects announced all the time, and especially like I kind of follow with a little bit of interest, some interest, the energy transition in Japan, because I think they have one of the hardest energy transitions to make out of all the countries, certainly a lot harder than what we've got to do here in Australia. They've been talking about floating offshore wind for like 10 years and announcing, you know, they had all these targets by 2020, we're going to have this many gigawatts. And now there's a 2030 target for, you know, multiple gigawatts. So far, they don't have any wind farms. And I'm not even confident that any of their announced ones are actually happening, you know, things are actually being made and about to be installed. And you see, so floating offshore wind is one of those things where you see a lot more announcements than reality. And I was a little bit surprised when I was putting together the research for this, that there are actually literally only 3 operating floating offshore wind farms. Yeah, so I might just take a quick look at the comments before I move on to the next part. Jack McDonald says one reason for floating offshore is that there's simply limited space available for fixed bottom. Yeah, definitely. And from Benjamin, I assume you're talking about the levelized cost of energy figures when you say that, because I didn't actually talk about geothermal. But you asked, do these stats on geothermal include the thermal energy too, or just electricity? And it should be probably levelized cost of electricity comparison, because I believe it is just the electricity part of it. I don't think that it is including any value for the heat. You can have a look at this report, and the full version of it tells you all of their assumptions, so you can definitely find that out if that's interesting to you. And geothermal is a topic I've never covered on the channel, and I definitely need to do that sometime. Oh, this is a nice comment from Dimitar. Been designing offshore oil rigs at my last company and now installing offshore wind turbines in the current one. And I mean, you can tell us maybe. I assume that most of what you knew from your old job still applies to the new one. And I know heaps of people in the industry who have come from oil and gas, and not just offshore, but especially for offshore. It's just, I know a lot of people that did it because they got sick of, contributing to the world's problems and wanted to contribute to solutions. But also, I think the transition has been a little bit easier now because renewables have gotten so mainstream. You can get paid normally in a renewable engineering job now. When I started out, my first renewables job was in 2006, I think, for this company, Diasol's, an Australian solar research company. And I remember my first pay review, I looked up what the, average engineer's salaries were. And I'm actually getting paid 30% less than what I should be. And I mentioned that in my pay review and was just told, everybody wants to work in solar. So, suck it up. That's what you have to take if you want to work in the industry. And for at least 10 years, that was the case, getting paid a lot less than I would have in another industry, and especially oil and gas pays well. But now it's not like that anymore. And so you see this, you don't have to be, an environmentalist to work in renewable energy anymore. You can just be interested in working on energy systems and make a decent living. So I think that's a really important part of the transition that's meant we've got so much more talent now in the field working on solutions. Oh, here's another question. It's a bit off topic. It's something I do talk about sometimes and will again in the future. From Ben Burton, at what point we can't react fast enough on the grid when the renewable power fluctuates? There's heaps of simple solutions for that. And in fact, batteries like lithium-ion batteries are already doing that role better and more cheaply than fossil fuels in, so many grids around the world, including in Australia. So I guess the answer to that question is lithium-ion batteries. And they don't need to be very big, because it's just it's a lot of power, but for a very short amount of time, and they respond so fast. So actually, frequency tolerances, voltage tolerances are getting tighter as we progress in the energy transition, because the battery technology is so much more responsive than the fossil fuels were. Okay, DJ Laundry List, nice name. Can you talk a bit more about Japan's difficult energy transition? I don't know if any of you saw a live stream I did a little while ago about Canada's energy transition. Actually, I know you probably didn't, because I forgot to make it public when we were talking to no one. But you can watch the recording. I want to do that for a lot of different countries. I have got planned to do one on Texas. I know it's not a country, but it's got a very interesting energy transition, and they treat themselves like a country. One to Australia, and yeah, Japan is one of the more interesting ones. Also, I think the UK and Germany are pretty interesting. Tell me if there's a country that you would like to see covered, and especially if you know someone who's an expert from that country. That's what's been stopping me doing that for Japan so far, is that I don't yet know someone that's like a real expert on Japan's energy transition. Okay, I was going to leave that there. And then I just wanted the final technical topic that I want to talk about, I'm aware I've run out of time. But one of the interesting things is because the design constraints, the characteristics of floating offshore wind in general, are really different to what has seen the wind turbine design evolution into this. Like every wind turbine onshore looks like this, right? Like 99.9% of them probably, and it doesn't have to look like that for offshore. And now that there is there's kind of like, it's kind of leveled the playing field, and who knows what the optimal design is for offshore and for floating offshore especially. Now we're seeing new technologies emerging, and there's so many startups now. It's not just Vestas and Siemens and GE and the old traditional manufacturers of wind turbines aren't the only ones that are now trying to get into offshore wind. So I just wanted to talk about some of those changed design constraints and some of the companies that are trying to take advantage of that. So the first one is that for floating offshore wind, we talked a lot about the stability of it and how do you make it stable, and the challenge is that you've got this really high center of gravity. So now there's an incentive to have a lower center of gravity, and one of the ways to do that is with a vertical axis wind turbine, also shorter towers. We talked about both of those briefly. So you see quite a few offshore vertical axis wind turbine companies around. I will say most of them are at the stage of they've made some computer images, and it's hard to see what they've done beyond that. But one of them is C12, and I mean, I know that they don't have turbines installed in the water, so even though this is a pretty good computer image, I'm nearly 100% certain that that's not real. So that's one option, and then there's another one that actually several people have commented on, not just this recent post, but other videos, keen to see me cover this technology. And it is one that I'm following closely, has heaps of interesting aspects to it. This is taken from a 2-Bit Da Vinci video. I'm sure a lot of you watch that channel as well. Yeah, they're combining a vertical axis wind turbine with energy storage as well. So you can't see in this particular shot, but somewhere towards the end, it's like energy vault, or any kind of gravity energy storage system, in combination with the vertical axis turbine. And I mean, you can clearly see that they're drawings at this stage, but there's some interesting stuff going on there. I'll have to talk about it more another time when I can get into the depth. So that's vertical axis wind turbines, and there's others. Multi-rotors as well, like WindCatching, and I did do a live stream that talked a lot about this. So this is one way that we can get like really a lot of capacity, a lot of megawatts with just one electrical connection, which I mentioned earlier that's one constraint for offshore. And it kind of only works onshore because you need the whole thing, like, I just realized I'm not even showing the screen. So this is WindCatching, or any kind of multi-rotor. And Vestas did do a project on multi-rotors as well, though theirs was onshore. You have heaps of small turbines together, adds up to a large amount of megawatts with one single power connection. It really only kind of works offshore, or it works better offshore, because the whole thing needs to yaw together now. Like a normal wind turbine, each individual one would be turning on its own, but the point, like the benefit that you get from the multi-rotor means that they all need to stay in line and they all need to yaw together. And I think that will be easier to achieve offshore. Like onshore, I imagine you need like wheels and it just seems really clunky. So that's another one. And then just so many different people revisiting two-bladed wind turbine designs and downwind rotors. So these are both topics I covered like really early on in the channel. So go have a look at the videos on why wind turbines don't normally have two blades. And also I made one, I think the title's something to do with how do you stop blades hitting the tower. So with two blades, Envision did one, for example. They had oh, actually, maybe I do have that. Yeah. So they had this two-bladed wind turbine that they installed at least a prototype of. I don't know that they ever did more than that. It's called the Eco Swing, and there you see it's two blades. The reason for the two blades that they stated was mostly an installation thing. You can put the two blades together on the ground and then just drag it up. So that was the point of that. But then the other cool thing about that project was that it had a superconducting drivetrain. And so there you can see there. That's definitely going to be something that we see more of in the future and probably worthy of its own video. I think lots of people commented that they wanted that, wanted to see me talk about that. So there's that one. MingYang 2B Energy also have made prototypes of two-bladed turbines, and theirs were both actually downwind, about 6 megawatts. And then Hitachi has made a 5 megawatt three-bladed downwind turbine. And I did see a few years ago lots of announcements for wind farms that were going to be supplied by those companies, but I never saw any information that had actually happened. So I think that all of those two-bladed or downwind ones from mainstream manufacturers have not proceeded commercially. But yeah, in some ways, I think that I think it's more suited to not having the big companies do this. They're already doing what they do in a profitable way, or not always profitable actually recently, but in general, they know how to make a lot of reliable wind turbines if you standard design. And so usually when you see like a disruptive technology, like, a really different way to design something, it comes from small companies that, have the energy to bother on, what starts out as a very tiny market. And yeah, they, persist with it. So I won't be surprised if the next really different to this wind turbine that actually breaks through, I won't be surprised if that's from a small company. And then the final thing that I wanted to talk about with floating offshore is companies that are making just the platforms. You just chuck whatever turbine you like on it. And I think actually that is what Hywind are doing. I'm not sure if they're like really wedded to their partnership that they've currently got with the manufacturer, or if they can put whatever they want on it. But Stiesdal is an example. They have a demonstration project now, and yeah, they're making this and this foundation, and you can put whatever you want on it. I assume that they're thinking a normal horizontal axis three-bladed wind turbine, but yeah, you could put something else on it. I've seen a lot of the startups are partnering with companies that design for oil and gas normally, and just getting them to design something for them. So yeah, I think that it makes sense not to reinvent the wheel, especially when you've got to put it in a harsh operating environment. So yeah, that's the end of the technical stuff. I talked a lot longer than I thought, and as I suspected, didn't get into energy storage or hydrogen, but we'll save those for another time. Let's just see what kinds of comments that we have. Ben Burton says Australia would only be powered for one day with Tesla power cell systems from Perth to Sydney. I think that's being generous. I don't think we have nearly that many batteries. I think that we have, minutes worth of storage in batteries. The Snowy Hydro 2.0, when that's finished, that will have a significant amount of storage. But at the moment, most of our storage is in hydro. And in the UK, he says that building out fast response gas turbines to cope on the grid fluctuations in the UK. Interesting. I'm not sure that agrees with what I understand to be going on, but look into it more. Okay, Bluebird123 says, have there been successful strategies in preventing collisions with the turbine structures and ships or wildlife collisions? They definitely done plenty of studies on wildlife collisions, as I've said, and I haven't seen any, other than that one crab that gets bothered by electromagnetic fields. I haven't seen any animals that are bothered by these structures. Usually when I see studies like that, the animals are happy to have somewhere to hide from ships. There is maybe some issues with the noise of construction. I know there's some ongoing studies in the US looking into how the noise from construction affects animals that, like whales are using their hearing is important to how they navigate the ocean and communicate. So I think that we're still waiting on that. But I actually haven't been following too closely what they did in Europe, but Europe has had offshore wind farms for a long time, since the 90s. I think the first ones were put in. So, I don't think there's any really big problems. More about storage, which I won't get into now because it's kind of a separate topic, and I definitely plan many more videos on energy storage. I'm trying to think what I've got coming up. Well, the most recent one was on pumped hydro, so that's obviously storage. And then I was recently in Newcastle, just north of Sydney. There's a company there called MGA Thermal who's doing thermal energy storage, but usually converting it back to electricity at the end. And yeah, like I mentioned, I want to do ocean energy storage as well, because there's just so much cool stuff happening in that field. So I'll talk more about that later. But yeah, I'll wrap up now. Gone a bit longer than I meant to. I need to thank WeatherGuard Lightning Tech for sponsoring the live stream. They also have a great tech newsletter and a podcast that I co-host with a couple of guys each week. The links to that are in the description. We talk about all sorts of clean energy tech news. A lot of it is about wind. In the latest episode, we talked about floating offshore wind, actually, and this company Hexacon are offering a floating wind platforms that are built like IKEA packs, so you can they make the stuff onshore and then drive it in like a flat pack, I guess, out to the port where you can put it together. And the most recent one, we also talked a lot about lightning, which is a huge big deal for wind developers and operators and manufacturers. These days, lightning strikes have been increasing in number and severity recently, and it's getting much harder to insure wind farms against lightning. And one issue that I deal a lot with my clients is it's hard to figure out whether blade manufacturer or the wind farm operator is to blame for damage that results from a lightning strike. So that's, if you're, working in the industry, that's definitely something that touches nearly all aspects of the wind industry these days, lightning. So check that out on your favorite podcast app, or you can watch it here on YouTube. The links to that are also in the description. And I also need to thank again the Engineering with Rosie Patreon team for their support. So if you want to join, then there we go. You can join us at this link. And if I move over here, you can probably see it a bit better. We've got Engineering with Rosie only Patreon Discord server where we chat about energy, and I always welcome the suggestions of the team for how the channel can get better and what topics are interesting. Upcoming videos next week. Finally, I'm going to release the video that I filmed at Boston Metal when I was there a few months ago now. That's really cool. They're a green steel manufacturer, and they've been at it for more than 10 years already, since the research was completed at MIT. It'll be all up from when they made their tech breakthrough in the laboratory to when they're actually going to be making big volumes of renewable steel or green low emission steel, zero emission steel. it's going to be like 20 years. And so I thought that was really interesting to talk about that development process, like what actually takes 20 years. Because, you know, so often when you see YouTube videos or read articles about energy technologies, it's this really early stage stuff, the lab scale kind of thing. And I think people don't realize that, you know, if it's something big and industrial like steel, that's 20 years between the science happening and the steel happening. So yeah, check that out. Yeah, and then next live stream, I already have a guest lined up. It's going to be in 2 weeks with David Osmond, and I'll just share his Twitter page. He does. I don't know if many of you are on Twitter. I actually really hate Twitter, so I'm not on it a lot. But this is one of the good things on there. He does this this renewable energy simulation where he kind of just takes the existing amount of wind and solar and energy storage in Australia and just scales it up to see how far we could get easily with renewables. That's basically the best way of saying it. So you see a lot of 100% renewables models out there, but that last 1%, 2%, 3% is the really hard part. So this is kind of a different way. Like instead of saying, how do we get to 100%? He's saying, how far can we get easily? So just a different way of thinking it. And yeah, I recommend having a look at his threads every week. He updates his model and shows what's happening this week with his, you know, imaginary energy system. So yeah, that's it for today. Thank you all for watching. That's the most important thing, that you show up, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.